Good afternoon to the worldwide community of UN volunteers. We are delighted the United Institutes of Training and Research and the UN Volunteer Organization. We are very, very happy to welcome you and to thank you for your interest expressed and joining our webinar today. We hope that we're going to be able to deliver a really interesting and insightful webinar for you. And this is where I would like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Nikolai Due-Gundersen for joining us today. He is a political commentator and analyst, and he has authored a really insightful and challenging book about the privatization of warfare. And I would really urge you, it's available online, and to really read that book because there are so many insightful paradigms and so many of those developments as conflict and the challenges related to move from a culture of conflict to a peace-building culture, and just how relevant so much of the work that you do. And this is why we thought that we would like to frame today's session very much around the theme of what are those skill sets based on the evolutions and the realities of peace and conflict negotiations in the field. And the way that we thought we would frame that is by looking at what are those skill sets and the realities of working in conflict situations, and for those of us that are working on international conflicts. Now, you may say to me, Dr. Jan-Hans Kutzer from UNITAR, have you gone crazy? What is it that you mean when you say working in situations of conflict and working on? And let me just quickly clarify that. So for the purpose of our session today, when we talk about working in situations of conflict, that refers to the efforts that focus on or take place in countries experiencing conflict, such as those offering humanitarian relief, providing development, or help with democracy and governance. For those of us that are working in international conflicts, that refers to the efforts that directly or indirectly seeks to manage, to mitigate, or to resolve conflicts, such as negotiating peace, agreements, preventing deadly conflict, building positive relations amongst adversaries, and developing secure and stable societies. Now, within that context, we have, when we look at the different sectors, we have security, political, economic, social, cultural. When we look at the levels of analysis, there is intrastate, local, national, regional, international, and global. When we look at the stages of conflict, there is the prevention, escalation, violence, de-escalation, stabilization, and then transition. When we look at the approaches to intervention, we look at military peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, development, diplomacy, and the very traditional humanitarian. So you see, the universe of peace building is highly complex, very dynamic, and we're going to today in our discussion with Nikolai focus a little bit on this to unpack it for you. So what I would like to do, I just want to see if my colleagues from the United Nations Volunteer Institute, if they are present, so that I can give them the word, but I don't see them present as yet. So what I'm going to do is hand you over very briefly so that Dr. Due-Gundersen can say a few words to build on the discussion and the dialogue that we're going to have today. Let me just, because I need to, voila. Nicola,
Yep.
Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to meet you all and to be here. As Dr. Johansson just mentioned, I am a political analyst. My focus is mainly the Middle East with a lot of field experience. I've lived in Jordan, Turkey, and in Kuwait as well. For those of you who may have an Arab background, أتكلم عربي, I speak Arabic. So yeah, today's session, I think that we will discuss sort of, how field experience can work its way into peacekeeping and how complex peacekeeping and post-conflict studies can be and how fascinating it can be. There's I think, a serious need to humanize conflict studies and to humanize the conflicts that are happening across the world, especially in the Middle East. And that's something which we will talk about in more detail as well.
Thank you so much. Before we start, I think it's really important for us that we also just take a couple of seconds and recognize the tremendous effort that the health workers, the doctors, the medical fraternity are currently out there in our communities as we all try to find our way and to make any sense of normality as we go through COVID-19. But more importantly, if those of you who have loved ones who have fallen due to COVID-19, we also take this moment in our exchange to celebrate the lives and the memories of these individuals. So allow me to say that we dedicate our session today in that spirit of humanity, in the greatness of, when we decide in our common humanity to get together, just the amazement and the power of our collective humanity in achieving collective goals. Voila. So what I would like to do is, for us, so what we're going to do is spend about half an hour where we're going to have this exchange and dialogue with Nikolai, and then I'm going to open the session and you can ask him some direct questions. So the first thing that I want to ask is, Nikolai, you said there is this great need to become more human and to have this human connection in the work that we do today. Can you please say to us, what do you mean and what are the recommendations in terms of, okay, it's great, but how do we do that? What are the associated skills, specifically for the UN volunteers?
Well, I think here there's a lot of things we can talk about. We can talk about, for example, understanding other cultures by visiting those cultures. I think that's very important. But also, I want to mention that most people and most cultures will have certain beliefs and core beliefs. And we've discussed in the past the idea of celebrating differences. This is a very important thing to do, but I think that also, to be frank and to be fair, most people, we all grow up in a certain environment. We will all have prejudgments, certain belief systems that we may or may not always explore further. And part of being more human is trying to understand others and to have empathy for others by, in a sense, taking a step into their environment as well. And there's various ways to do that. So as I mentioned before, living abroad is one of them, but also when you are in an international environment, such as, for example, the UN or Geneva, getting to know people from other cultures is very important because it's how you create a better worldview. And from that, I do believe we can create more empathy for each other and ourselves.
Nicola, empathy, you would agree with me, that is but one set in a plethora of tools and skill sets. When we do see the diversity of communities that constitutes this global community, how do we then, when we serve under the blue flag of the UN, How then would you say are those elements that are required to be able to ensure the neutrality of the institution? And when you go into a context where you have, the good cop, the bad cop, and everything in between, realistically, how does that work?
Well, of course, the world is always complex, and conflict zones, of course, are always complex. I think that there's a lot of organizations that I've worked with that one of the things that they struggle with is going into a conflict zone or other areas and actually listening to what people need or want, while, as you said, maintaining a certain neutrality. So I think that part of it is also to be able to act in a neutral manner, to facilitate negotiations, to be good at listening to the needs of others as well, to see what is needed on the ground. Not all international organizations will do that. Certainly from my time in Jordan, I know that some of them have gone in with preconceived notions, which is, of course, an issue. So I think neutrality and the ability to listen to what locals on the ground are saying in any context is very important as well.
Thank you. And from your perspective, Nicola, you recently, you've been involved in really observing a number of the conflicts in the MENA region. Can you share with us some of those sort of evolving dynamics of modern conflicts? So in terms of during the acute phase of the conflict, then immediately after, and then when we start trying to move towards a reconstruction and recovery phase. Talk us a little bit through some of those based on the evidence of projects that you've seen and the diversity of the skills again, and even in some of those specific areas that you see there is need to develop the competencies and the skill sets.
Well, indeed, I think one of the most common things we viewed in the short to medium term is displacement of people. So when there is a conflict, of course, we have refugees. And one of the things I saw in Jordan and also in Saudi Arabia recently is the increase of refugees who are then absorbed by other countries. And in the short to medium term, there is the issue of resources. There's the issue of how there would be mutual integration. So I saw, for example, in Jordan, I saw protests in 2013 regarding Syrians in the country, even though Jordan has spent a lot of resources and time on trying to just ensure that Syrians are welcome in that country. That is a medium-term issue because we then have the balance of integration, albeit perhaps temporary, for refugees who are in a new host country versus the long-term goal, which is to allow them to return home. I think that is the more complex issue, of course. In order for them to return home, conflict has to come to an end and institutions have to be rebuilt. That is a much more complex picture. The rebuilding of institutions, the restarting of an economy as well. Let's not forget that. I was actually on a TV show just yesterday talking about the economic cost of warfare and how, unfortunately, warfare creates opportunities for certain political players. That, of course, means that they would support conflict as opposed to peace. And that is another huge bridge that we have to cross.
And where does the dialogue, where does the discussion start? Where we, because we see so many countries that relied on certain natural resources, and the shift in that economic output. And we also see in parallel the dynamics of conflict. Whose responsibility is it to start with those dialogues and processes? And how can, so that's the first part of the question. The second one is then, how can we as UN volunteers contribute to having a constructive dialogue around these complicated issues?
I think here we actually have some excellent points. Firstly, in any conflict zone, it would be hard for those involved to be seen as neutral facilitators. This is one of the reasons why we have certain international organizations such as the UN and others who may actually be able to get more easily involved because they are coming from the outside. What we then have to do is we have to focus on building continuous trust. So neutrality does not mean not understanding the culture. As I've said before, the notion that if you're going to act as a neutral facilitator, you still have to take into consideration how is this culture structured, what is the language of this culture. For example, it may be Arabic or it may be a specific dialect. So we have to have the cultural framework can act as a form of a filter, or as a framework to allow a neutral organization to go in and start negotiations and to step by step build trust by showing they understand the cultural aspects of that country and wish to genuinely contribute to a shared vision for national rebuilding. And I think that's very important, that the organization or the facilitators must come across as people who don't have their own agenda. And that requires trust. And I think trust is built through understanding the culture.
And building on this, do you think that the United Nations as an institute do integrate sufficiently this cultural capital in policy making that dictates the terms of reference and the modus operandi of its mandate and the execution of those mandates in the different areas where they operate?
Well, again, the UN is a huge organization. Let's remember that, with a lot of operations in different countries. I do feel that the UN, that they do their best. They want to ensure humanitarian action and aid on the ground, and it will vary from country to country and conflict to conflict. There are unfortunately some parts of the world where perhaps external organizations would be less welcomed because of the way that culture has been previously structured. So enclosed societies may be less welcoming of any outside actor. But again, I do believe that the UN, you have a fairly international field. You have fairly international people as well. So I think that the UN is doing a fairly good job. But I would say that the best thing you could do when you go into different spheres of operation is probably focus on language. So if you have staff going into Somalia, those who lead the team should be Arabic speakers, and preferably they should speak Somalian Arabic or that specific dialect. So they can act as representatives of the UN and be seen as people who want to get close to the culture that they are speaking to. We need to remember we want to have dialogue with, as equals, not from above, so that everyone should be seen as entering an equal partnership.
Thank you. Dr. Due-Gundersen, let's turn the lens now squarely on you. Tell us your story. What made you decide to go to the Geneva School of Diplomacy and to study your master's? And that, if I'm not mistaken, your book, The Privatization of Warfare, was actually born there. And then as you started developing this intellectual capital to become a political commentator and analysis, what were those moments where you realized this is exactly where I can add value? Talk us a little bit through that experience.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Yes, when I entered GSD, I was about 23 years old. I just finished my bachelor's in literature and had some exposure to politics. And what struck me about GSD at the time was the field experience of various professors. So we had retired ambassadors, we had people, professors who had field experience abroad, and I found myself drawn to the Middle East in a sense because of my thesis. And I thought to myself that here we have a thesis which is on Middle East case studies, but I want to get to know the Middle East better, not just through text, but by going there. We had a program, as you may recall, called Salia, which helped us connect with different people. I'd like to add, by the way, it was a very successful program because I married the person who I connected with, who was based in Jordan. So there you are. She's now my wife for 7 years. So a very successful program. But it just goes to show, so what struck me about that approach was, again, humanizing the Middle East, that we have people from all over the world who we connected with online, from different cultures who we spoke to. And I thought to myself, this is very, very important to actually have a balance of political analysis, but also on the ground experience. So I think the best thing to do is to go to the Middle East. That's kind of how it started. And I found that my master's therefore became an extended investment in picking up more and more soft skills that I would consider to be part of diplomacy and international relations.
So just to summarize, so you say that going to the field and infusing yourself within the dynamics of the different languages, the different practices in the local environment, and to learn from the local population before you make any recommendations. Learn from the locals, because very often there are some, really good cultural practices that exist within the community that can be used to in a combination of what any organization, because it's really about that partnership, isn't it?
That's exactly right. So you're learning from those on the ground can give you a better understanding of how another culture may work and the politics of that culture, how it may work as well. And as you gain more and more trust as well with locals and you befriend them, they will start to tell you a little bit more about the politics of their country. And that can be a great learning experience. You learn so much by listening. You really do.
And then, of course, magic happens and you fall in love and you get married.
Indeed.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Um, Dr. Due-Gundersen, if you agree, I'm going to open the floor for questions. And
Please.
what I would like to do is to, give the floor to Momina. Let me just find her. And then ask her to pose her question. But now, of course, I don't see her. Right, Momina. There you go. Voila, Momina, you have the mic, so please.
Yeah, good evening. Actually, sir, I wanna ask that I am a blogger and I write blogs, but at some moment, at some point, every country, every person comes to the uh, uh, to point that their country is everything. They don't talk about the peace all over the globe. How we can combat this problem?
Yeah, I think I see you've also written your question here. It's good to know that this is an issue. I think that's quite common. Unfortunately, this idea of how should I put this? I call it self-nationalism. So the idea that somehow there are people who think that their country is the best, and I think that this is, of course, a misconception and one that the UN tries to combat. That we should celebrate our differences while also doing so through equality. And if you're writing a blog and you're writing on a variety of topics, I think that if you have any travel experience to draw on, that would be quite helpful. What you might also find is that when you write about other countries, including your own, you can make sometimes comparisons where you celebrate those differences, and that could be eye-opening for others. But it does take time. It's, depending on which country you live in or where you're from, we all are guilty to varying degrees of living in a small bubble, even myself. I mean, I speak English as my first language, and so there are times when I'd rather communicate in my first language than switch to Arabic because, maybe I'm tired or whatever. We all have these small biases. The important thing is to be aware of them, and you see how that can feed into your work. So if you are, for example, a travel blogger and you write about international relations, you can write about your country and others from the perspective of equality and celebrating those differences.
Momina, I would like to build as well on what Nikolai was just saying. And first and foremost, I would like to, say, well done. I think what you do as a blogger, and the fact that you look for these little nuggets of greatness that exists in each and every community, and how we as a global community can celebrate this differences that makes us unique as a species, rather than as Nicola was saying, sort of the rhetoric of the populism that we have, because it breeds this idea of something that is different from us we need to fear. And the United Nations is a very good example, because it's a highly complex but yet a highly diversified organization that is still able to deliver a number of really excellent interventions that contribute to nation building, peace intervention, and there are various areas which you work in. And I think individuals like you, by using these very specific skill sets, in your case, using your blog to find these ripples of uniqueness that exists in different communities, and to bring that to light, and that we as a collective humanity can celebrate those differences, because that's what makes us unique. Thank you. Let's go to Chai Hong, who asks you as well a question. I am going to try to find him. Forgive me, it just takes time because I have to voila. Nicola, maybe you see his question, and then because Chai Hong asks, he says, Dr. Due-Gundersen, I have experience in monitoring the security situation in the Lactate Basin based on security incidents data collected by UNDSS colleagues on the ground. I am very much interested in field work and gathering these statistics by myself to have a profound understanding of the status quo. In your view, what are the core competencies required to secure a field position, such as reporting specialists in conflict areas in Africa, and maybe more specifically, the Lake Chad Basin?
Well, I think if we're talking about conflict zones, of course, firstly, we want to make sure that whatever you decide to do, you prioritize your safety as well. But on top of that, I think that right now we're living in a world where when you enter diplomacy and you study diplomacy, there's so many different paths, and often it is what you make of it. I would say in my case, I didn't, to be completely fair, I did not have a job lined up when I went to Jordan. I went there, I started working eventually as a researcher, but I think that some of the opportunities will not present themselves until you are there, and also you build your experience, build on what you can. So when I was in Jordan, for example, I began writing and publishing articles about the Middle East and about Jordan, drawing on, again, on my field experience. So what I'm getting at here is, in some cases, if you ensure, of course, that you're safe and you come up with a small project that you could do, and you go to an area where you can collect that data safely, you may then be able to publish your findings, and actually that itself, you create your own position or your own background to sort of act as a strong stepping stone into getting a job related to the data you've collected, related to your recent project. So a lot of self-starting is, I think, quite important.
Nikolai, would you disagree with me if I say, we all need to be more entrepreneurial in how we want to create our different careers or the areas in which we want to work, which is in the case of Chai Hong, which is really specialized. And talk to us a little bit, again, based on your experience, how you, as you said, you came to GSD, you weren't quite sure, but you were very, very clear. And I remember my relationship, for those of you that are in the is it started because I was at the Geneva School of Diplomacy way back then, and the one thing that struck me was always the clarity of what Nicola wanted to achieve and what he was working on at any given time. And the example that I like to use is to say you were very entrepreneurial because you knew what you wanted to do, and then how you put the system and the processes and your planning in place to achieve that. So it was almost as if you looked 5 years into the future, and then you worked back in producing your results. Talk us a little bit through how you define that.
Well, I think that, as you quite rightly stated, I did not come to GST knowing precisely what I was going to do in terms of a precise career choice, but I knew diplomacy. At the time, ironically, I had not decided to do my PhD, and I want to bring this up simply because I got field experience and work experience after the master's and before my PhD. Had I jumped into the PhD, I may have saved some time, but I bet you my thesis will be very different and my experience will be very different. So I think that it's important, as you mentioned, to have an entrepreneurial spirit. Don't have too many fixed ideas about what you want to do, but go out there, listen a bit to your instinct, and see what happens. I actually found that some of my articles from GST, while I was in Jordan, I published them. These are articles I wrote, as assignments, and I published them. And when I started doing my PhD here in London, this is when I began to be invited onto television. And one of the reasons people came to me was because they saw I had field experience. When I was in Jordan, I was still building that experience. But when I came back to the UK, I was part of one out of very few people, if you like, who had that kind of experience where they said, okay, we can put him on TV to talk about the Middle East because he's got the right image and he knows what he's talking about and he can draw on context. And that is something I had not expected to happen. If someone had said to me at GST, you're going to be on TV pretty soon, I would have said, you must be kidding, So the point is, you never know what can happen. This is very positive. Don't plan too much, but ask yourself, what is your passion? Follow that instinct and ask yourself, how can I channel this passion into a career or into a path while being open-minded? Be an entrepreneur. If you're a blogger, for example, create a website, create perhaps a YouTube channel, play around with the ideas that you have, and just don't give up.
Thank you so much. I'm going to unmute. Right, unmute. Right, Mohsen Ali, you are unmuted. Can you please go ahead and pose your question?
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. I have a question regarding global conflict prevention. Like, for instance, if we look at the scenario of Israel and Palestine conflict. So, being an educationist and being a UNV, what kind of strategies and tools are there which we can adopt or utilize to help in this situation to prevent this sort of global conflict?
Well, I think that, as I'm sure you're all aware, the Israel-Palestine conflict is, in a sense, ongoing, as in it is one of the key points of Middle East studies. There is no easy solution, but I think that, again, part of being a neutral facilitator is to try to understand both sides of a conflict and to listen to what is being said, preferably, if possible, on the ground. I think at this stage, there is no easy solution to this particular conflict, especially. And at a time of the Arab Spring and also the coronavirus, I think that we see states kind of going into lockdown over this. I would argue that, again, trying to understand both sides is of the utmost importance. And this is how you can build steps to being a neutral facilitator. I'm not sure if you had if you wanted to build any more on that question, or if there's any other angle you had.
Yeah, you also said that learning language is one of the components. So yeah, again, if we learn language, so for instance, if we can communicate in a particular language like English, for instance, so knowing English language and we can communicate easily with this language, so why it is important to learn their language?
Yes, thank you for clarifying. Thank you very much. Well, I think, again, funnily enough, some of these things you don't find out until you do it. I've mentioned trust before, but also when you learn another language, you don't just learn another language, you learn another mindset. And I think this is very important. So, for example, from my own experience with Arabic, I didn't know this till I started speaking the language, but there are words in Arabic that I could use where I cannot translate them into English. I have to explain what they mean. And this is because Arabic has more words than English does. And so it's a very precise language. It's known for its literature, for its poetry. It's known for being quite beautiful. And so this is something I would not have known if I had not studied the language. So when you look at conflicts, if you learn the language of both sides, I'm sure that it will allow you to go into the culture of both sides and to understand both sides better. When you learn a language, you also learn about the values of that culture and the values of that society. And I think that that is essential to being a diplomat, whether you're with the UN or not. And there's so many things you can do with that kind of skill.
Thank you so much, Nicola and Mohsen Ali, for asking that question, because it builds very nicely on what Margaret is asking. And it's exactly what you said in your last part. I think we should not oversimplify to say, when we talk about language and cultural skills, that it's about just speaking another language. No, it's to validate who the community you are trying to serve and understand what are the dynamics in terms of language and cultural expressions of being and that we can identify with those and build on that to facilitate discussion, community projects, because very often what we have is we come in and as the development world, and we very often surprised when we say, but the community does not seem to appreciate what we try to do, or there are clashes where we've seen, and I have experienced this during the war in Sarajevo, when I worked in, well, I've worked in 27 different conflict zones across Africa, and Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. And it was always interesting to see how important it is when you go into a situation, be it conflict, be it post-conflict, be it peace building, how important it is to be able to understand fully who are the communities that you are not there to help, but that you are serving. And I think that is what's important, is this notion of serving the community, because it's about that partnership, and it's about understanding everything. And language and culture is one of those means, one of those tools for you to get under the skin and understand that complexity of the dynamics. And I'm going to ask now to hand the mic to Anne-Margaret, because her question is really, really valid. So just give me 1 second. Voila, there we go. Anne-Margaret, you are unmuted. You have the microphone.
Okay, hi. Here it is. Good morning. Good afternoon. Yeah, so as I was describing, I have quite a lot of experience in Latin America and in Colombia. So my question is, when I want to change the region, and I agree that it is very important to know the language, to know the culture, but it is still a process that you can, or that needs to be lived. So at the beginning, to kind of from the beginning be effective in establishing a good relation with the community that I want to serve, what would you recommend are are ways to kind of get into the culture before having lived it?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, obviously there will be some transferable skills from other regions to a point, but I think also if you're going to move from one region to another, as you get prepared for that move, ask yourself, are there people on the ground in your current country from the culture you're about to move into that you could connect with? This is something I've often said to my students. For example, those who want to focus on the Middle East, I've said to them, you know, at Kingston University, we have a lot of people from the Middle East, so get to know them. You know, get to know those people, reach out to them, say hi, and get to know about their families, their countries, so that you actually have, if you like, a support group to draw on. You could even perhaps tell them that you're actually moving. You could be honest with someone you know who's from that culture and say, listen, I'm about to move to a new region. I'm a bit concerned about how to ensure that I can understand this new region, and I understand that you're from there, so you know, would you be able to help me out? Sort of, what are the things that you feel are the values of the country that you're from? So you might find that, especially with an international community, even before you move, you can draw on that community to ask some questions and to get to know people who are from that culture as well.
Okay.
Thank you. There was also a very interesting question from Rembe Seme. So I am going to try and find him. Voila. Rembe, you are unmuted, my friend.
Yes, I can get you in.
Go ahead, my brother.
Yes, my question is, I am a UNV at national level, but what measures and techniques should I put in place in a community where targeted assault is at its peak? I'm putting this in an experience of Africa, for instance, and South Sudan in particular, where when you belong to a certain community, and of course, going to the other community, you are looked at as someone who is an enemy, for instance. So what measures and techniques should I put forth to ensure that I complete my task successfully to enable me move in my career?
Well, obviously, you're talking about a situation that's very complex and very difficult. I can only imagine what it's like to be targeted. I've recently, actually, just about 3 weeks ago, I began attending meetings at Parliament here in the UK where they talk about Sudan and South Sudan and precisely this issue. There have been, as far as I'm aware, there have been some conferences, including in Sudan, where groups that are targeted are able to discuss things in a slightly safe space. And we also have this in London for that reason. In other words, we have activists from Sudan who have come to London where they can discuss these issues in a more open venue without feeling that they are targeted because obviously they're in another area. I appreciate that may not exactly work in your particular scenario. I'm not sure if there's any short to medium term solution, but I think that making people aware of what's happening is a good first step. So for example, if you have connections with international organizations, making them aware of what's going on, trying to get them involved. Again, the idea of a facilitator may be quite helpful. There may be people, for example, who work for an NGO where they have a division for Sudan, but where not everyone is exactly aware of who's being targeted or what's happening. So I think awareness is key, definitely.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to ask now to John. John James was asking a really important and very topical question about Kashmir. So if I can just find him, I am going to try to unmute his mic. Nikolai, can I ask you, because I can't find him.
Hello.
John, that's you. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm John. I am a UN civic education volunteer from Pakistan. So my question is that we all know about the situation of Kashmir, India-Pakistan conflict. But the thing is that in such regions, how can we promote, or how the global community is suggesting such solutions in promotion of peace education in such regions?
Yes.
So this is an open question in the form. So we can suggest some of the solutions.
So if I understand you correctly, you're asking with regards to what's happening in Kashmir, so what are the solutions that can be suggested, or how can we ensure the world is becoming more focused on it? Is that your question? Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. I think, again, what's good about your question is it touches upon some of the key aspects of conflict and such difficult situations, which is the question of justice and injustice, and also awareness. One of the things I discussed actually yesterday was the idea of what has been termed conflict fatigue. So forgive me for saying this, but the idea that unfortunately the way that media covers certain conflicts means that people actually don't pay attention, especially I think in the West, where you don't want the killing of innocent people or any other travesty to become just another thing on the nightly news. And I think, again, I would say awareness is key, but how do you spread that awareness? You have to humanize the conflict and show what's happening, and to make people more aware of the cost on the ground and the innocent people who are being targeted or killed and whatnot, to try to connect with a wider audience. And I feel that news does not always do that. We all watch the news, various channels, and often this or that conflict, it just becomes another thing that's happening in the world. That approach has to be reversed, and I think that that's going to take time. But for those who want to discuss Israel-Palestine, Kashmir, or any other conflict, focus on human stories, talk about the innocent people who are involved, and also talk about if you have your own involvement or ways that you've seen others get positively involved, so that you can then spread further awareness, but do so from the angle of humanizing what's happening.
And I would like to build on what Dr. Due-Gundersen was just saying. I think we have to be so careful that we very often, our own language that we use when we talk about victims and the oppressed and people who fall through the safety net, these are all dignified human beings. And I think as members of the United Nations, we owe that to them, to acknowledge and to recognize and to give them back any shape, form of dignity that has been removed from them. Now, you may say that is very, very philosophical. How do we actually do it? And this is where I would like to now share with you. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Paulina Kowalska, to share a little bit with you, because we offer online programs that you can register for, and it takes you through these different capacity building scenarios, such as the gender question. How do you engage in peace negotiations? And it very much takes you through a mixed methodology. It uses different mediums in which you can engage. It's a self-paced study in which you can then enhance your skill sets in terms of so many of these different skills that we were touching on in our exchange. And it's very specific to those skill sets within the United Nations, because are we neutral? Are we it's all these complicated layers, if you want, that it allows you to understand that much better, and that when you go into the field or in your different communities, that you understand the highly complex network and modus operandi in which you work. But I would like to hand over to my colleague, Paulina Kowalska, to explain a little bit what is the process. Paulina, it's over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. I apologize for joining a little bit later due to the technical issues. I'm very happy that we have so many participants, and for those who are interested in taking these online courses, I am Paulina. I'm based in Geneva, from where I am coordinating the this registration for the online courses and how to sign up. So the easiest thing, the easiest way, it is to just write me the email. My email address you will see just in a second in our chat. It is paulina.kowalewska@unitar.org, and I will just write it in a second. So just drop me the email with that will include the basic information like your name, surname, your roster number, and your UN email address. Based on that, I will reply to you and provide you with the link to the online registration form. And also you will receive once again the flyer with the catalog of the 12 courses. You can sign up to 5 courses. And after filling the online form, we will verify the information you provided online, and I will return to you with further instructions and login credentials. This process should not take more than 1 week, but once you receive from me the login credentials, then you can start your online course on our learning platform. And this is just to everybody to make it easier. I will just write once again. Yes, so everybody can see this is my email address, and I think this is the easiest way to communicate with all of you.
Thank you so much, Paulina.
Thank you.
So let's go. Maria has a question. Sorry, Juan had a question. Let's give the word to Juan first. And then, so Juan was saying that I work in the UNW regional office in Latin America and the Caribbean. We usually help give support to the countries instead of doing field work. In the case of the Caribbean, specifically Haiti, I find to be a little more difficult to get involved because I do not speak French and the culture is very different. How can I create a better relationship to understand their culture without speaking the language or working in the field?
Yes, I was actually reading that question in the chat. So, going back to not speaking French, I used to speak French myself when I was in Geneva. I've now pretty much forgotten it. So there you go. But yes, there are ways to try to understand other cultures. I mean, firstly, the fact that you are aware of differences is a start, because again, we've been talking about celebrating differences, and I think that trying to understand how those differences work is definitely one way of doing it. Again, from where you are, can you connect with people from that culture who, you can speak to them in English, for example, if you don't speak French? There's always a way. I certainly feel this. I admit that had I not learned Arabic, I would not have thought like that, because it was only after learning Arabic and returning to England that I started to connect with people from, the Arab world in the UK. So my point is, it's possible to connect with other cultures even from your home base, if you, go out and just find people from these communities. So it's not impossible, and there's always going to be some culture shock and some culture clash. But we try to understand with other cultures, what are the core beliefs, what are the core values. Let's remember, everyone, that we all have core beliefs and values that in some cases we would never want to change. And so having some mutual respect for that and trying to understand other cultures, I think, is a must.
Juan, you have the mic if you want to, pose another question or to respond.
Hello, everybody. Well, actually, I was just making a comment about what was said before, that Dr. Nikolai said something very important about the way media should contribute to the constitution of the peace, but usually it doesn't. That at the University of Peace, which is a mandate of the United States, of the United Nations, they have a very interesting master's degree program called Media and Peace, which focuses on this particular issue. So I was just wanted to make a comment, but thank you very much for giving me the mic.
Thank you. I would just like us to, we're speaking broadly about the media, and I would just like that we also, throw caution in the wind, because there are media channels that remain very, very objective, very factual, and it's not all the media. So I would just like that we also, make a difference between those media outlets who remain committed to present accurate, factual information, rather than us sort of saying, one broad brushstroke, all media. Again, we have allies there in that helps us to articulate the message, and I think we also need to recognize them. Let's see, there was Paulina. Okay, Paulina, it would be good that because there was a question from Rabia, just to please confirm, and you can just pop in. The question was, Paulina, just to confirm, are you talking about the UNITAR courses? If you can just respond to that, or what you can do is just bang an email to Paulina directly. So what we would just like to confirm is, of course, there are these UNITAR courses that are available to you through the United Nations Volunteer Network. And Paulina sort of briefly gave you an overview. And should you want to know more about it and how you qualify to register for these courses, Paulina would be very happy to provide you with that information. And the reason why I wanted us to invite Nicola and for us to have this discussion with him is just because he is no different from you and no different from me. We all have this commitment to serve our common humanity. And, you know, okay, he has his PhD, he has worked, but remember what he said in the beginning. I didn't, when I came to Geneva, I didn't think that I, you know, wanted to do a PhD at that stage. I had all this experience, and but then somehow the dynamics and the experiences and how he then was able to, and I use the term, build his professional capital. And I think it's in that framework that I really thought it was a valuable session for us to share for Nicola to share with us, you know, how we built up his professional capital. And it's not about him being a doctor or being today a political commentator and analyst. It's more the individual that you have in front of you. How did he constitute who he is today in terms of how he serves the different communities? And, you know, he shared. So I would be very happy to take another couple of questions for either Paulina, myself, or for Dr. Due-Gundersen. Okay.
Yeah, if I may, I just, going back to the media, one thing I want to mention is I do use a website that I've just uploaded here, mediabiasfactcheck.com, that I find is very useful, because when I do my research, I want to know what is the slant of certain channels. As you mentioned, Dr. Kutzer, there's a lot of channels that are doing a fantastic job that are objective and that do humanize conflict. But because you always want to be sure, this particular website that I've been using, you know, they tell you, are they tilted, for example, to the left or to the right, politically speaking. I find that very useful, so I can at least know what I'm getting from this channel. Are they using loaded or emotional language, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought I'd just put that out there.
Thank you so much. Very, very valuable point. Okay, I think so we have no more questions. So Nicola, if I can just ask you, sort of, you know, you've seen some of the different questions and some of the attention being drawn to so many of these protracted and complicated conflicts that just seem to drag on. What would be your sort of final thoughts that you would like to leave us in terms of, you know, how can we continue to build what I would call these transversal competencies that would allow us to be able to contribute more effectively in terms of first who we are as individuals and how we can then use these skill sets and amplifying, you know, the mission of the different UN agency or the context that we will be working in?
Well, I think when it comes to protracted conflict, one of the problems is there will always be certain players who have an interest in prolonging conflict. That's a sad reality, but that doesn't mean that we have to be powerless. There are so many things that we could do right now. I mean, for example, if we are not happy with what's happening in Kashmir or in Yemen, can we pressure our local leaders? Can we write to them and say, listen, you know, I'm not happy with the fact that my government is not doing anything to alleviate suffering in Yemen. Write a letter. Start an appeal. You know, there are things you can do, especially through social media, to gain more and more attention regarding that conflict, and to again show that people power can work. I think we're seeing this more and more. When people decide that they're going to stand up for what feels right and they're going to talk to their local leaderships, that puts political pressure on those others. So there are things we can do. It may take time, but just don't give up. Don't feel powerless. Remind yourself, as you said, to be entrepreneurial is not just about your career, but it can also mean to say, you know what, I feel that what's happening abroad is wrong, and I want to talk about it.
On that note, Nicola, that very optimistic and that very personal experience, I would like to thank you yet again most sincerely on behalf of the United Nations Volunteer Organization and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much. And I would like to, of course, also thank all the volunteers who joined us today. I will also pop in, you can contact me, of course, through my the email of Paulina, and I will say to you, bye-bye, thank you. We look forward to seeing you enrolling into some of these courses, and I give the final word to Paulina to close this session for us.
Yes, hello, can you hear me once again? Yes, correct. So thank you very much for the participation. I tried to reply to all your questions coming in the chat, but once again, I will repeat it once again. The easiest way to sign up for the online course is to send me the email that I wrote you in our chat box, and then I will provide you with a UNV courses flyer. You have a full catalog of the courses that you would like to sign up, and further instructions what to do next. And this is going to be the easiest way to communicate. And for those who just joined like a minute ago, I will once again type my email address. It is paulina.kowalewska@unitar.org. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just scroll up, you have Paulina's email address. If you just scroll up in the chat box, there it is. Feel free, please, to lift it from there. Thank you so much, everybody. Please look after yourself, stay healthy. And again, muchas gracias, Nikolai. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for hosting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.